Welcome back to Stu's Aircraft Factory. I'm going to show you the upper intersection fairings on the RV8. Here's the inspiration as a pit special that I saw at Oshkosh. There's a little bit of a gap between the fairing and the gear leg, which is important because these fairings are going to move, and you also see the anti-chafing tape that's there, which is going to be replaced about every year. Just to emphasize that gap, look at the lower intersection fairing. You see it's more pronounced. The wheels move and the fairings move, so you need to make sure that you have a little bit of a gap in there so that after you paint it, it just doesn't rub right away and make a big mess. So let's show you how we did it on the 8. So just some masking tape to protect our aerofoil gear here. And I make marks on the top and the front and the back so that we can make the fairing look the same on each side, left and right. Once you have those marks, using some 1/8 inch 3M fine line tape to where you want the fairing to end. And this will give us an equal looking fairing on the left and the right side, as well as on the gear leg itself, measuring about 1 inch down. And that's where we want the fairing to end. It's using some clear tape to cover up all the fuselage and the gear leg so that when we put this expanding foam on, it doesn't make a big mess and stick to the fuselage. Here's the expanding foam. I like the white stuff. There is some yellow stuff out there, but I find that it doesn't dry internally if it's too thick. Also, have seen some fairings attempted using clay putty, and this is a much better way to do it. It carves easier and it'll just have a nicer product if you use expanding foam. And just starting with an X-Acto knife, aiming for a nice contoured shape from the gear leg to the fuselage and aiming to expose that 1/8 inch tape that we had put on there earlier. So once you're happy with the X-Acto knife, take out a nice coarse file. Here's the coarse file here, now just creating a nice contoured shape. And at the top, you'll see that 1/8 inch tape start to be exposed, and we're looking for about a 1/2 inch gap there. So that when the fiberglass is all laid up, it's nice and flush against those two parts. And if you have any voids like you do on the bottom here, just go ahead, use some masking tape, spray some more foam in there, and then trim it up 24 hours later. All right, so here's the key. So this is electrical tape around the gear leg to create a gap. So there's about 8 layers there. You see it's quite thick. And we're going to use that so when we lay up the fiberglass, in the end, we actually have a gap between the fairing and the gear leg. And then we use some aluminum tape. If you don't do that, the fiberglass will stick to the foam and make a bigger mess. So here is what it should look like when you're all ready to start laying up the fiberglass. Give it a little bit of wax to help you break the mold at the end. And then we're just using 1.5 and 2 inch wide fiberglass strips. And here you see the peel ply that we'll use in the end to make it nice and smooth, save us some sanding. And I just use West Systems epoxy, working it into the weave so that it should be clear before you put it onto the fuselage, working that epoxy all the way into the fibers. And just a couple pieces at a time, working all the bubbles out and aiming for 3 to 4 layers everywhere throughout the fairing. Making sure we're going past that 1/8 inch tape that we put on there so the fairing is big enough. Working the bubbles out there, you see. And then when that's all done, here's the peel ply. This is going to save you some sanding as well as suck up some of the excess resin. And 24 hours later, let it all dry, peel it off. Now getting the fairing off, use a little chip chaser, I'll show you here in a second, and then the fairing will pop off the fuselage, but of course we need to Dremel line in the inside underneath the gear leg to actually spread it apart and get it off. Once it's off, go ahead and darken up that 1/8 inch tape so that when we put it back on, we can see where the tape is easier. And then the fairing back on, and just trace that dark blue line onto the fairing so we know now where to just trim it. So a rough trim, I use tin snips initially, works well, no dust. And these sanding boards work really well for making the contour nice around this edge. Now we can get rid of all the foam, get rid of all the clear tape. And now we're actually going to drill the fairing to the fuselage. And we're going to use some existing holes in the bottom that go into the gear cover plates. So there's a cover plate on the bottom there that has about 6 holes in it, and we use 2 of those to attach the fairing. So make sure when you put your 1/8 inch tape around that you actually cover those 2 parts. Then we clamp it back together, sand one side, and put clear tape on the other side. And when you put this clear tape on, make sure you cover the tiny gap between the parts so that when we add some fiberglass here, it doesn't bond them back together. So this is going to be our little tab that we're going to use to put a nut plate on to actually attach the 2 pieces together. So same as before, one side is waxed with clear tape, the other side is just sanded fiberglass. So when we put 3 layers of fiberglass on there, it only bonds to one side, and we have a nice little lap joint where we can attach a nut plate to. And it should break apart 24 hours later easily, peel off the tape, and that's where we're going to put our nut plate. Just give it a final trim, no need to get fancy here, just trim off the rough edges of it. And I'm just tracing the side of it here so when I put it back on the fuselage I can see where it ended up, and then I can drill my 1/8 inch hole. Alright, now we add some micro balloon to the whole part, just trying to make it nice and pleasing shape, nice contour, using a combination of 50 grit emery cloth and some sanding pads, starting fairly coarse and then ending up with some fine sanding pads. And here's the sanding block again to get the top where the gear leg is nice and flat. And anywhere the 2 parts kind of join, this sanding block makes a nice job of making that edge. Now we're looking for pinholes. There's going to be a lot, so you might have to go back and do micro balloon again, fill up the pinholes. Show you a close up here. Obviously the big one there is where the screw goes, but you can see all the other tiny little pinholes that you might have to fill with micro balloon again. The small ones you can fill with this UV smooth prime. And just painting it on. Trying to not to go too thick, because if you put that stuff on thick it tends to crack, and just a bit more sanding. And then back to sanding, and that should help several of the pinholes. You might have to go back again, put a little bit more micro balloon, maybe another little thing of UV smooth prime, but depends how nicely you want to hand it all off to the painter. And here I always give it a little shot of primer. You'll see the voids better, you'll see the pinholes better too. So there's the 2 holes we were talking about earlier that go into the gear cover plate. And then you see the 3rd screw just attach the fairing back together. And we're going to add one more fairing at the top just to get it nice and snug against the fuselage. So to do that, there's some screws underneath which we don't want to hit, so we'll mark 1 inch up and 2 inches up from the screws, so we make sure where we put our fastener is not going to hit anything that's existing. And then we'll put our number 6 screw right in between there. So a number 40 bit to start, just to mark the fuselage where we want it, and then you can take the fairing off. Number 40 all the way through, and then enlarge it to number 33, and then we're going to tap that with 632. Now if you're concerned about drilling a hole in this area into the gear area, go ahead, call the company, tell them your concerns. There's no problem with another tiny hole in this area to attach the fairing. Then marking the bottom where our chafing tape is gonna lie. And here's the 3M chafing tape that I use throughout the airplane. And there the fairing is installed. So you see the 1 screw in the top, 3 screws on the bottom, but the one is just holding the 2 fairings together. Nice and flush against the fuselage, which is fine. But the key for these fairings for longevity is to have that gap that you see there in between the fairing and the gear leg. So I hope you like it. Like, subscribe, and see you on the next one. Cheers.